It all started with a simple idea: a night walk through the forest near the city. I, Jackson, was seeking adventure. It was a warm summer night. The sky was clear, and the moon shone brightly. I thought it would be an exciting experience, something to break the monotonous routine of my suburban life. I couldn't have been more wrong. I entered the forest with my flashlight, laughing to myself at my own audacity. The trail was well marked at first, and the moon provided enough silvery light to guide me. I was prepared with my backpack, carrying a water bottle and a printed map that my mother had insisted I take. Soon, the trail began to narrow and become less visible. The trees seemed to close in around me, creating grotesque shadows that danced in the light of my flashlight. That's when I heard the first strange sound. It sounded like a branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. I laughed, trying to convince myself that it was probably a deer or some small animal, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to keep going, but I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort from my mind. Every step felt heavier, and the forest seemed more sinister. Gradually, I realized I was veering off the main trail. I tried to turn back, but all the trees looked the same, and the path became increasingly indistinguishable. I started to get frustrated, trying to remain calm. The darkness seemed to engulf me, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to have a life of their own. Suddenly, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, pointing my flashlight, but there was nothing. I felt an unsettling presence. There was no denying it. I was not alone in that forest. I tried to ignore it and move on, but the feeling of being followed persisted. I suggested to myself that I sit down to rest and think of a plan, but the truth was, I was terrified. That forest, which had seemed so innocent and full of life during the day, had transformed into a living nightmare. Sitting there in the darkness, I could only hear my breathing and the distant sounds of the forest. As I sat there, trying to calm my nerves, I realized that the silence around me was almost absolute. This only increased my anxiety. I stood up and decided to keep going, determined to find my way back. The moon was high in the sky, but it seemed less bright, as if hiding behind a thin layer of clouds. I continued walking, but the forest became denser, and the sounds more peculiar. That's when I saw something that made my heart stop. A little ahead, among the trees, there was a small wooden cabin. It was partially hidden by vegetation, but it was unmistakable. My first reaction was relief. Perhaps there was someone there who could help me. However, as I approached, a sense of dread grew within me. The cabin seemed abandoned, with broken windows and the door slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I decided to go inside, hoping to find some sign of life, or at least a safe place to spend the night. The door opened with a loud groan, revealing a dusty and dark interior. The only light came from my flashlight. In the center of the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There was a wooden chair, turned on its side, and dark stains on the floor around it. It looked like dried red liquid. I stood paralyzed for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Who could have been there, and what could have happened? The atmosphere of the cabin was suffocating, filled with a sense of unease that seemed to seep into my bones. I decided I couldn't stay there. I turned to leave, but then I heard a sound behind me, a slight dragging of feet, as if someone were moving slowly. Panic took over me. I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but I saw nothing. My heart was racing, and I knew I had to get out of that cabin immediately. I ran to the door and back out into the darkness of the forest. Without looking back. Back in the forest, my heart was pounding like a drum. Every sound seemed amplified. The cabin was behind me, but the fear remained. I needed to get out of that forest. The moon was hidden now, and my flashlight was the only thing guiding me. I felt completely vulnerable, as if I were being hunted. As I ran, I heard footsteps behind me again. This time, they were faster, more hurried. There was no doubt someone was following me. I tried to increase my speed, but the uneven terrain and tree roots made it difficult to escape. I stumbled several times, almost falling, but I kept going, driven by pure survival instinct. My mind was racing with thoughts. Who could be following me, and why? The answer seemed obvious. The cabin. Something or someone in that cabin didn't want any witnesses. I kept running, trying not to think about what would happen if I were caught. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trees and darkness that offered no escape. Then, I spotted a small clearing. In the center stood an old wooden watchtower, rising against the night sky. The structure looked precarious, but it could offer me some protection. I ran towards the tower, but instead of climbing it, I decided to use it as a reference point. If I could keep it in sight, I would have a chance to orient myself and find my way back to the city. I continued running, my legs burning with exhaustion, but adrenaline kept me going. I looked back and saw the figure emerge from the shadows. It was a man, his movements slow but determined. He didn't seem tired. There was a coldness in his eyes that terrified me. He was hunting me with the patience of a predator. The forest became denser, making my passage more challenging. Branches and thorns tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't stop. Finally, I began to hear the distant sound of a road. My heart leaped with hope. Civilization was near. I redoubled my efforts, pushing my body beyond its limits. Then, finally, I saw the faint lights of street lamps through the trees. I ran with all my remaining strength, emerging from the forest onto the shoulder of a deserted road. I looked back, expecting to see my pursuer emerge from the darkness, but he didn't appear. The terror didn't disappear, but the sense of relief was undeniable. Without wasting any time, I started walking down the road, hoping to find help. I needed to warn someone about what was happening in that forest. My legs were trembling, and my body was exhausted, but I was alive. The forest, with all its horrors, was behind me, and the promise of safety seemed closer. As I walked down the deserted road, my mind was still trapped in the terrifying events I had just experienced. I kept looking back, fearing to see that man again. The road seemed endless, and every sound from the forest beside me made me jump with fear. I needed help. I needed to tell someone what had happened. After some time, I saw the headlights of a car approaching. I felt a wave of relief mixed with apprehension. I waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The car slowed down and pulled over next to me. An elderly lady rolled down the window, looking at me with a concerned expression. "Are you okay, young man?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. "No, I need help," I replied, trying to control the trembling in my voice. "Someone is following me. I need to get out of here." She opened the passenger door and I quickly got in. As she drove, I began to tell her everything that had happened that night. She listened attentively, occasionally glancing at me with worried eyes. Her expression showed disbelief and horror as I recounted the cabin, the strange liquid, and the relentless pursuer. After this terrifying experience and getting lost at night, I never want to hike alone again. It was a cold October night when it all began. My name is Thorn, and I decided to take a night hike in the national park. I had planned this adventure for months, excited by the idea of experiencing something out of the ordinary. Little did I know that I was about to live through one of the scariest experiences of my life. I set out around 8 in the evening, armed with a flashlight and a vague idea of the trail. Darkness soon enveloped me, and the silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the rustling of leaves in the wind. As I ventured deeper, the trail that had seemed clear before started to become more difficult to follow. After an hour of walking, I realized I was lost. I tried to backtrack, but everything looked the same. Tension started to build. I decided to stop and check the map, but the darkness made everything more complicated and confusing. Each step seemed to lead me further into uncertainty. That's when I heard a strange sound. Something was moving in the darkness. Something that wasn't the wind or the usual nocturnal animals. It was the sound of footsteps, but not my own. The sense of imminent danger made me stop. "Anyone there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the silent forest. There was no response, only oppressive silence. I decided to move forward, my senses now on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified, heightening my anxiety. I felt cold sweat trickling down my back, despite the chilly night. And then, I saw a figure moving between the trees. It was a man, but something about him didn't seem right. He watched me, motionless, and in that moment, I knew I was in danger. The figure remained still, as if waiting. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the fact that I was lost in the forest at night, but the presence of this strange man made everything even more terrifying. I decided to back away slowly, never taking my eyes off him, but each step seemed to echo in the silent night. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling as I tried to sound more confident than I felt. The man didn't respond. He just kept watching me with an intense, disturbing gaze. His silhouette was just a blur against the darkness of the trees, but I could feel his eyes fixed on me. The feeling of being hunted grew with each passing second. I started to walk faster, trying to put distance between us, but the figure began to follow me. Fear took complete hold of me. I began to run, branches scratching my face and arms, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the forest. The man didn't run, but his determined stride seemed relentless. As I ran, I tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flew from my hands, rolling away and leaving me in darkness. Panic seized me. I tried to get up, but I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. I looked around desperately, searching for the light of my flashlight, but all I saw was the man's shadow slowly approaching. With difficulty, I managed to get up and limp towards the flashlight. I picked it up and pointed it at the man, hoping the light would drive him away. To my surprise, he stopped. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice almost lost in despair. The man finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "You shouldn't be here." His words resonated in my mind. Words resonated in my mind, filling me with a terror I had never felt before. The man's words echoed in my mind. You shouldn't be here. Fear consumed me entirely, and the only thought left was to flee. With the flashlight trembling in my hands, I started running again, ignoring the pain in my ankle. Each step was a struggle, but adrenaline kept me going. The forest seemed like an endless maze. Branches and bushes became constant obstacles, tearing my clothes and skin. The sound of my footsteps and heavy breathing filled the air, but there was no sign of the man following me. However, the sense of danger persisted, as if he could appear at any moment. Running blindly, I eventually reached a clearing. The moon illuminated the open space, providing a brief sense of relief. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and try to orient myself. I looked around, searching for any sign of a path or trail that could lead me back to civilization, but the forest seemed to close in around me, suffocating and impenetrable. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me. I turned quickly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The man was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with those cold, relentless eyes. You can't escape, he said, his voice low but clear in the silent night. Terror paralyzed me for a moment, but the need to survive was stronger. With a final burst of energy, I started running again, crossing the clearing and entering the dense forest once more. The pain in my ankle was excruciating, but I couldn't stop. With each step, I felt the man's presence drawing closer, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of fear and desperation. The forest seemed endless, but finally, I spotted a faint light in the distance. It was the road. With the last of my strength, I ran towards the light, the renewed hope giving me a final push. When I finally emerged from the forest and reached the road, I fell to my knees, exhausted and relieved. I looked back, expecting to see the man emerge from the shadows, but he wasn't there. The forest was quiet, as if nothing had happened. The deserted road ahead seemed like a sanctuary of safety. The moon illuminated the asphalt, and the silence was now a welcome relief, contrasting the oppressive darkness of the forest. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The man was nowhere in sight, but the sense of danger still lingered. I got up with difficulty, my ankle throbbing with pain. I started walking slowly down the road, hoping to find some sign of civilization or a passing car. Each step was a struggle against exhaustion and the fear that still consumed me. The night's silence was profound, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly. After walking for a few minutes, I spotted the faint lights of a gas station in the distance. The sight of the lights filled me with renewed hope. I quickened my pace, ignoring the pain in my ankle, until I finally reached the station. The place was almost deserted, with only a few cars parked and a flickering fluorescent light above the convenience store. I entered the store, where a middle-aged attendant stood behind the counter, reading a magazine. He looked up as I entered, clearly surprised by my appearance. "Are you okay, buddy?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. "I got lost in the forest," I replied, trying to keep calm. "I need help getting back to town." A driver who was refueling and returning to the city offered me a ride. The driver, an older man with a kind expression, got out and came over to me. "I'm Matt," he said, extending his hand. "I'm heading to the city. You can come with me," I replied. "Let's get out of here." I got into the car, feeling a little safer. As we drove, the road became more familiar and a sense of normalcy began to return. Matt asked me a few questions about what had happened, and I told him the story, omitting the most terrifying details. He listened attentively, nodding from time to time. We soon arrived in town and he dropped me off at a police station. I thanked him and went inside, still trembling and shaken. I recounted my story to the officers, who listened attentively. They promised to send a patrol to investigate the area, but there was little they could do that night. I returned home with the help of a taxi. When I finally entered my apartment, I locked all the doors and windows, trying to ward off the persistent fear. That night in the National Park forest would never be forgotten, a vivid reminder of a terrifying encounter that nearly cost me my life. And as I lay in bed, exhausted and still trembling, I knew that I would never go on another night hike again. The horror of that night would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of how close I had come to true danger. Lost at night. I never imagined that these words would be part of one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. My name is Rowan, and this is the story of what happened on that fateful night. It all started as a simple car ride. I've always enjoyed the tranquility of deserted roads, but on that night, peace turned into horror. I was returning from a visit to a friend who lives in a distant town. It was late, and the road was empty. The moon was high in the sky, casting a pale light on the asphalt. Without much thought, I decided to take a shortcut that my friend had mentioned was faster. I didn't know that this decision would change my life forever. As I drove, the temperature dropped drastically. A freezing wind blew through the cracks in the windows, and a chill ran down my spine. I looked around, but all I saw were the shadows of the trees along the road. The sense of safety disappeared. I started to feel the first wave of panic when I realized I was lost. I kept driving, trying to find a reference point, when I heard a strange noise coming from the engine. I pulled over and got out to check. The silence of the night was oppressive. When I opened the hood, I noticed nothing visibly wrong. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps on the asphalt made me shiver. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. Must be my imagination, I thought, trying to calm myself. But the sound persisted, echoing on the deserted road. Fear began to turn into terror when I saw a figure emerge in the distance, slowly walking towards me. It was a man, but something about him didn't seem right. He was dressed simply, almost like a traveler, but his eyes shone in a way that froze me. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a hoarse voice. My words caught in my throat, and before I could respond, he advanced towards me. The figure slowly approached, each step resonating on the empty road. I was paralyzed with fear, but the need to survive overcame the dread. I quickly got back into the car, locking the doors with trembling hands. The stranger was now just a few meters away, and his eyes shone with an intensity that terrified me. I started the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. I tried again, to no avail. Panic set in when I realized the man was at my car window, tapping on the glass with a sinister smile. "Need some help?" he said, his voice low and menacing. Terror grew within me. Without thinking, I opened the opposite door and ran down the road. I ran like never before, feeling the icy wind against my face. The road seemed endless, and I knew I couldn't stop. Behind me, I heard the heavy footsteps of the stranger, his labored breathing mixing with the sounds of the night. My heart was pounding so fast I thought it would explode. I had to find help, but the road was deserted and dark. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a small house in the distance, its faint light the only hope in that sea of darkness. I ran towards it, praying for someone to be there. When I arrived, I frantically knocked on the door, shouting for help. An elderly lady opened it, her face marked by surprise and concern. "Please help me," I begged, looking back to see if the man was still following me. She pulled me inside, quickly closing the door. "What happened?" she asked, trying to understand my panic. I quickly told her everything, and her face turned serious. "You must stay here until dawn," she said. "These roads are not safe at night." Her words only increased my fear, but at least I was in a safe place. The night passed slowly, every sound outside keeping me on alert. The lady, whose name was Martha, offered me tea and kept me company, trying to calm me down. As the hours went by, I started to relax a little, but I knew the danger was still out there. I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Martha was welcoming, but her eyes showed genuine concern. We sat in the small living room, surrounded by antique furniture and the soft ticking of a wall clock. The hot tea helped soothe my nerves, but the fear persisted. As Martha spoke about the dangers of the roads at night, I could barely pay attention. My mind was fixed on the stranger and what he wanted from me. Suddenly, we heard a noise at the back door. The sound of heavy footsteps on the floor made my heart race again. Martha looked at me with wide eyes. "Stay here," she whispered, slowly getting up to check. I wanted to protest, but my voice failed me. Martha moved cautiously down the hallway. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, the sound of a door being forced open invaded the house. I ran towards the hallway and saw Martha struggling to hold the back door, which was slowly opening, its hinges creaking under the pressure. "He's here," she shouted, her voice filled with despair. I rushed to help her, pressing my body against the door. On the other side, the stranger pushed with force, his face just a threatening shadow in the faint light of the kitchen. "You can't escape me," he growled, his voice muffled by the wood. Martha looked around desperately, searching for something to reinforce the door. I was struggling to hold it when the door started to give way. "Use this," she shouted, grabbing a chair and forcing it against the doorknob. With a snap, the door closed, but we knew it wouldn't hold for long. The man banged furiously on the door, each blow resonating through the house. The sound of the blows was incessant, each one stronger than the previous. We knew he was determined to get in. I looked around the kitchen, frantically searching for something else to block the door. We found an old wooden shelf and, with a joint effort, pushed it against the door. The next impact made the shelf shake, but it held. As we struggled to hold the door, we heard a noise outside. I looked out the kitchen window and saw the flickering lights of flashlights. A neighbor had come out to see what was going on. He saw the man trying to break in and shouted, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The stranger hesitated, his face contorting with frustration and anger. The flashlight beams multiplied as more neighbors came out of their homes. Drawn by the commotion, "Call the police," someone shouted. The man looked around, realizing he was surrounded by witnesses. With one last threatening glance in our direction, he turned and ran into the darkness. Martha and I hugged each other, shaking with relief and exhaustion. When the police arrived, we explained everything, from the initial encounter on the road to the desperate attempt to break in. I will never forget that night and Martha's courage. I learned that sometimes the true monsters are human, and that even in moments of terror we can find strength where we least expect it. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.